Welcome to Disciple Dojo. In this episode, we are going to be reviewing the SBL Study Bible. Before we jump into that, if you haven't already, go ahead and click that subscribe button. Hit the notifications icon. That helps basically let YouTube know we like this channel. We want to see more of it. If you find our study Bible reviews helpful, or our teaching videos, or you like our nerdy superhero seminary videos, you subscribing and enabling those notifications, that's a very tangible and completely free way to help grow this YouTube channel. So now that that's out of the way, let's look at this study Bible. So if you saw the recap video that I posted a couple of weeks ago, I went to SBL, the Society for Biblical Literature, their annual meeting. This is my second time going as a member, and it's basically Disneyland for Bible nerds. I mean, there are papers and presentations, and there's a massive book display where everything is usually 30 to 80% off. Now, I knew that the SBL Study Bible was recently published and that I would be picking up a copy at SBL. So this was actually the first book that I bought, and I bought it to do this review. Now, if you're not aware, the SBL Study Bible is an update, sort of a reboot of the old HarperCollins Study Bible. Now, this is the first edition. There is a second edition. I've never used the second edition of this. I've had this first edition for like 25 years. I don't know the differences between this and the second edition, but we've reviewed this here on the channel. I'll link it in the video description below, and you can see my thoughts on the HarperCollins Study Bible. But the HarperCollins Study Bible was an annotation of the Society of Biblical Literature. So a lot of the same people who were involved with this were involved with this as well. But this includes almost entirely new resources. In fact, I was looking through both of these, comparing them, and I did not see almost anything in this study Bible that was in this one. So that's why I say it's a reboot. I mean, it's the same kind of general theme. This is intended to be an academic Bible. This is not a Christian Bible. Many of the contributors to it are not Christians. There are Jewish contributors, Muslim contributors, agnostic contributors, and there are a couple of evangelical or Orthodox Christian contributors. But this is not intended to be a devotional Bible. This is intended to be an annotated study Bible, mostly for academic, non-religious usage. The Society for Biblical Literature is open to all views, all beliefs, all faiths. It's kind of the Wild West. If you're interested in biblical scholarship for whatever reason, for whatever ideology, for whatever religious views you may or may not have, SBL is open to you. So that's important to note from the outset. This is not a Christian Bible. Second thing that's important to know is this is the updated edition of the New Revised Standard Version, and that's one of the other reasons I want to pick this up. I have the New Revised Standard Version updated edition in our SVUE digitally, but I don't have an actual print copy of it. And so I wanted to have at least one print copy in my library, and I knew that I wanted to pick this study Bible up when it came out. So this ticks both of those boxes. Now, this is the paperback edition. I believe there's a hardback as well. As of right now, I think those are the only two bindings, and it is 2,200 and I believe 2 pages long. It is duotone, so sort of shades of blue and gray and black, but there's no full color, nor are there any maps in the back. It's double column, and the cross references are in the bottom right-hand corner of each page, and then the study notes are at the bottom of the page, as well as little mini articles in these shaded blue boxes, and some charts and maps and diagrams sprinkled throughout. So let's actually look at it and see what you're going to find between the covers. So here's a comparison to the first edition of HarperCollins and the SBL Study Bible. It's a little taller, it's a little thinner, not by much, and it's slightly bigger. Now, the HarperCollins was very, very plain layout. Again, the first edition, I don't know if they changed much significantly in the second edition. And the notes at the bottom were annotations, not full study notes. So just brief annotations that go along with various verses. The SBL Study Bible is laid out a little more, say, graphically pleasing. The notes are more substantial for the most part. And it's 2 colors. So the chapter numbers, the section headings, and then this little divider bar are in blue, as are these little mini articles sprinkled throughout. There are a few illustrations, photos, pictures, Not a ton, but there are some. I don't believe there were any in the original HarperCollins Study Bible. And so here's what you're going to find when you open it up. Now, the first thing you're going to notice, and I need to get this out of the way, the ghosting in this edition is atrocious. This is the worst bleed-through ghosting I've ever seen in any of the study Bibles that I've reviewed. There's like triple ghosting. You can see not just what's on the page on the other side and what's on the next page, but sometimes even what's on the page under that. This is basically printed on tissue paper. Really, really distractingly bad ghosting, especially if you're trying to highlight. Just good luck. You're highlighting both sides of the page at once, basically. And it gets really hard to read when there are pictures on the other side or something printed. Now, I have kind of bright studio light, so that makes this a little easier to see on camera. But if you're reading this in normal light, anytime there's something on one side, it's going to really, really bleed through bad on the other side. And it's just very distracting overall. So just know that up front, this edition that they printed is terrible when it comes to the paper that it's printed on and how bad the bleed through is. But aesthetics aside, what are we going to find? Well, you're going to have your table of contents. Then you're going to have the books of the Bible listed alphabetically. Now, this does include the apocryphal or deuterocanonical books. So you do get the apocryphal books from all of the Christian traditions, not just the Roman Catholic apocrypha, but also the books that Orthodox believers use as well. Then there's going to be a guide to how to approach this study Bible. And right up front, you can see they're very open about this. What does the study Bible include? The SBL Study Bible does not expect readers to have any particular religious commitment. Readers from all religions or no religion at all are welcome to join in the conversation about these ancient texts. So that is the perspective that they're operating from. This is put together by contributors of all varieties within biblical scholarship. Another important thing to note, when it comes to these sidebars, they tell you many of the sidebars come from Bible Odyssey, an SBL created website that introduces the public to the academic study of the Bible. Readers are encouraged to visit Bible Odyssey, and there's the website right there, BibleOdyssey.org, for expanded articles and additional information on the Bible more generally. That's good to know, because what makes this study Bible unique, a lot of the material you can find on BibleOdyssey.org. Freely available. After that, you have the preface to the NRSV UE. So the NRSV UE is specifically intended for scholarly academic use, not just Christian or church use. And so there's a preface that explains that a little bit more. Next comes the overall editorial board, and then all of the contributors. Now, there are a ton of contributors, 5 pages worth. You got Bill Arnold for Deuteronomy, David De Silva did 4th Maccabees, John Goldengay does the Psalms, Nijay Gupta, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Richard Bauckham, 2nd Peter and Jude, Richard Hayes, Galatians. And then you have some noted Jewish scholars as well. Michael F. Fox, Song of Solomon, Jacob Milgram, Leviticus, Paula Fredrickson, Romans. You've got TikToker Bible celebrity Dan McClellan has a little article in here on the names of God. There's also pretty heavy representation by not only women, but also of scholars from international or ethnic minority communities. Now, this is one of the only study Bibles that I can think of that I've ever seen that actually has a little introduction to why there is even needed a table to delineate the different measurements. And then there's a section about money and biblical monetary units and sort of how they develop. So this is actually pretty cool. I like this. It's not just giving you a table of weights and measures, but it's actually giving you a little bit of background on why weights and measures in the ancient world were important. And then you come to the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament. It opens with an essay about the ancient Near East. There's a list of the different deities in the ancient Near East, all of the different peoples, Persia, Mesopotamia, Israel, Egypt, Canaan, Anatolia. This is really helpful. If you've watched our Bible background series here on the channel, a lot of these names might be familiar. There's a note about the figurines that are used in idol worship. Then there's an essay that's specifically on the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. It talks about the way it's broken up, the way it's divided and classified in both Jewish and Christian canons. There's an essay about the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then you come to the introduction to the Pentateuch, specifically the first 5 books. And it gives a history of source criticism and kind of the classic JEDP Wellhausen documentary hypothesis. But it also notes that has sort of fragmented and splintered, and that there are a number of documentary hypotheses now. And then you get into the text of Genesis. So I'll read from the introduction and just give you a taste of the approach you're going to find in the Genesis notes. Modern interpreters of Genesis agree that the book is neither a scientific nor a historical explanation of the past in the sense that these terms are used today. It does not provide the reader with exact facts of what happened long ago or precise historical dates of events. For example, the ages of the ancestors probably are not a reflection of ancient Israelite lifespans. Sarah probably did not give birth to Isaac when she was 90 years old or when Abraham was 100. These inflated ages may have been intended as an expression of power of God and to convey that God is the source of procreation. So it's common in academic or more liberal circles to argue against the long ages of the early chapters of Genesis, Genesis 1 through 11, people like Methuselah and Adam living hundreds and hundreds of years old. But they jump right to Genesis 12 and forward, the ages of Abraham and Sarah. So that lets you know that in the mind of the person doing the notes for Genesis, the idea of a miracle happening is that's out of bounds from the beginning, because the whole point of the Abraham narrative was he was physically too old to have children. That's the point. That's the entire thrust of Abraham being that old and Sarah being that old when Isaac was born. So just know right off the bat, that's what you're going to be getting in the study notes. There's an essay here on how in the beginning is probably not the correct way to translate it. That it should be, as the NRSV has, when God began to create the heavens and the earth. And there is a study note. Again, these are not full study notes. These are more annotations. But there is a brief study note that talks about the symmetry of Genesis 1 and how days 1 through 3 correspond to days 4 through 6, and that highlights the uniqueness of the Sabbath, day 7. But there's no chart or anything laying it out visually, so that could easily be skipped over. But this is a good and an important point. As is the quick note over here in 114 that the designations for sun and moon are not used, but they're called greater and lesser light, possibly because sun and moon are also the names of other ancient Near East deities. Now, in this note here, there's a point where the source critical assumptions affect how the text is interpreted. And here's what I mean. It's talking about Eden being a second creation story. It's even labeled another account of the creation. And then they say, also, God is now named and is viewed as more anthropomorphic and fallible than in P. P is a hypothetical source. Note the unsuccessful experiment in creating animals to be man's helping partner in 2:18 through 20, and the human-like afternoon stroll in the garden in 3:8. Now, I think both of these points are pretty unlikely, honestly. I don't think there's anything in the text that leads to the idea that God was experimenting by bringing forth the animals. I don't think there was a failure. There was a build-up and an illustration that none of them were his ezer kenegdo. And so that led to the creation of the woman. But nothing in the text suggests that that's a failure. And also the notion of God taking an afternoon stroll in the garden, I just think that's not in the text either. When God shows up, he shows up, Baruch Hayom, in the wind of the day, and he exercises judgment. There's nothing really in the Hebrew text about God taking a breezy afternoon stroll, even though that's sort of a traditional kind of folk theological view. So I don't know, this note is just a little eisegetical to me. Now they also, interestingly, at chapter 2, 18 through 23, when it talks about the woman being created as the helper, his partner, they make this odd note. The man also names the woman, which may suggest his authority over her, but this aspect of their relationship is muted until the woman's punishment. Again, I think that's reading into the text something that's not there, because later Hagar is going to name God, and there's no sense that Hagar has any authority over God, even though she's the first person in Scripture that gives God a name. So there are just a couple of problematic notes here at the beginning of Genesis. There are also some other odd notes throughout, like, for instance, after the flood, when Noah comes out and plants a vineyard, there's just a note here. The story also describes the origin of wine. I mean, yeah, Noah did plant a vineyard and get drunk, but the text nowhere says he's the first guy that ever did that. He probably would have had to have learned it from somewhere. So just an odd little note to put in there. And then there's also a note here about the infamous curse of Ham. And they conclude by saying the curse of Canaan, which is who Noah actually cursed, may therefore be an attempt to give later Israelite behavior the authority of age. So in other words, Noah never actually did this. This was just created to basically give authority to Israel's subjugation of Canaan, rather than the subjugation of Canaan having a history that goes all the way back to the original descendant of Ham named Canaan. So it's just two completely different set of operating assumptions that you can come to the text through. When we come to Exodus, there's a long, extensive introduction. And rather than go through the notes in Exodus because they're done by the same scholar, I just want to read a couple of the excerpts that give you an idea of how this scholar is approaching Exodus. In talking about authorship and date, says the number of contradictions, stylistic differences, narrative breaks, and repetitions one finds within the book clearly indicates that it was not written by a single author. So some of the things that this author notes as contradictions in Exodus are, number one, in the story of the plagues, there are passages in which the God of Israel hardens the heart of Pharaoh, who refuses to let the Israelites go. In other passages, Pharaoh's heart is hardened by the king's own will, so that he himself is responsible for the plagues that are said to be the result of divine punishment. So this interpreter is saying that's an example of contradiction in the text. Now, we've done a video here. We've done two videos, one by Professor Ben Grimm in our Superhero Seminary series, and one where we've actually looked at Pharaoh's hardened heart. I'll link both of those in the video description. But seeing this as a contradiction is more than the text itself warrants. He also puts as a contradiction that in Exodus 19, it says that God gave them laws at Mount Sinai. But then in chapter 18, the people had already arrived at, quote, the mountain of God, which makes it sound as if there are two holy mountains on which the God of Israel resided, or that Sinai is the mountain of God. I mean, these are just anything but contradictions. So I just want you to see the operating assumptions that this author is working from. Another supposed contradiction, the long story about the origin of manna, Exodus 16, is written in a style that differs from the style of short narratives, such as the battle against the Amalekites in Exodus 17. And the story of the golden calf in Exodus 32 constitutes one of the narrative breaks in the book because it interrupts the story of the construction of the tabernacle. So in the mind of this interpreter, these and similar observations demonstrate that Exodus as we now have it is a product of a long and complex process of compilation, revision, and rewriting. But in terms of what that compilation was, there's a paragraph here that talks about over the past 50 years or so, scholars have been challenging the traditional documentary hypothesis theories, and that now many, especially European scholars, and this author of this section in Exodus is a European scholar. I believe he's Swiss, French. Many, especially European scholars, now use a somewhat different model, whereas many scholars in North America still work with the documentary hypothesis, so that there is currently no consensus about the formation of the book of Exodus or the Pentateuch. And then we come to Exodus itself. He talks about the birth story of Moses. And he says, the story depends literarily on the birth legend of Sargon I, the legendary founder of the Assyrian Empire. Both texts share an important number of motifs. Since Moses' story cannot be older, now this is the assumption that he's working from, the Moses story can't be older than the Sargon story. It confirms a dating of the Moses narrative to the 7th century. It's tempting to understand the first written story about Moses as a reaction to Neo-Assyrian royal ideology elaborated upon at King Josiah's court with the intention to show that Moses is as important as the most important king of Assyria. Now, this scenario only works if you assume that Moses' story cannot be older than the 8th century story of Sargon. And that's an assumption that not all biblical scholars share. And I just find it a great example of kind of how these documentary theories are often built upon very questionable sets of assumptions and criteria, that if you remove that criteria, it really significantly weakens the whole enterprise. And that's why there's such widespread disagreement about all of the various sources in spite of what the text itself says. So then in terms of the historicity of the Exodus, There was never an Exodus as described in the Bible. However, the story certainly preserves several traces of memories that constitute the background of the biblical account. Like the Exodus narrative, the story of Moses and his life seems best understood as a literary construct in which memories of various different historical figures and events were combined. Even if you don't believe in inerrancy or infallibility of Scripture, like even if you're not evangelical, if you believe that Scripture is trustworthy overall, then this is going to be very problematic. Now, after you get past the Torah, there is an introduction to the historical books right before Joshua. Then after the historical books, there's an introduction to the poetic and the wisdom books. So there's a good article that introduces you to biblical Hebrew poetry, kind of giving examples of how it works. There's an introduction to wisdom tradition, especially within Egypt, which has a heavy influence in the Proverbs. And then after Malachi, this does include the apocryphal or the deuterocanonical books of the Old Testament. There's an introduction to the apocryphal books, which books are included in which traditions. And then there's an essay on the Hellenistic world and the impact that Alexander had in spreading Greek culture throughout. And then you begin the apocryphal books. And I do want to point out, my friend David De Silva did the introduction to 4th Maccabees. If you don't know David, we've had him here on the channel talking all about these apocryphal books and why they're important, even though they're not on the same level as inspired scripture. And then after 4th Maccabees, we come to the New Testament. At the beginning, there's an introduction to the New Testament, discussion of the literary context, how it was compiled. There's a note on page 1715 about the term Jew or Judean and how this is translated in different passages. There's also a note about historic Christian anti-Semitism. Now, this author does say, furthermore, avoiding the term makes it difficult to consider the question of Christian anti-Judaism, which was historically justified by New Testament texts that describe Judaioi as Christ killers and children of the devil. Now, I don't agree with either of these. I don't think any text refers to Jews as Christ killers in the New Testament, or that Jews in general are ever called children of the devil. I think Jesus does specifically use that term in one of his interactions with the temple leadership. But regardless, people have misused scripture to say such things, and Christian anti-Semitism is a very real thing, even though the New Testament itself does not lead one logically to embrace it. Then after that introduction, there's an introduction overview of the Roman Empire. So it gives an overview, the different ancient people groups, the different rulers, the events that happened surrounding Jerusalem and leading up to its fall in 70 AD. There's a good article on the imperial cult. This will have a big impact in various New Testament places, but particularly in the book of Revelation. This was a good overview article. I enjoyed this. Then there's one on the historical Jesus. It traces the different so-called quests for the historical Jesus and what was behind those, and how ultimately they all just sort of resulted in not really anything. And so they petered out, and some people are waiting or seeing if there's going to be a 4th quest for the historical Jesus. And then you come to the introduction to the Gospels and Acts. It's a very basic map. There's a discussion of the gospel composition and the older theory of something called Q. And the note says, some scholars suggest that Matthew and Luke used another common source labeled Q from the German Quell source, in addition to Mark. Yet this assumed document remains hypothetical. No evidence for Q exists outside of Matthew and Luke. Other scholars offer an alternative theory and posit that Matthew came first, Mark then substantially abridged Matthew, and Luke created a new edition from Matthew, deleting and adding various segments as well as amending common material. In the end, we cannot know the precise literary relationship between the Synoptic Gospels with certainty. This is a refreshingly honest note. I really appreciated that. I thought it was balanced. I thought it presents the lay of the land and then just admits what some people seem so reluctant to admit, which is we just don't know. Then at the end of Acts, there's an introduction to the New Testament letters and the Apocalypse. So basically the rest of the New Testament. There's talk about the disputed and the undisputed Pauline letters. So some scholars think that Paul didn't actually write all the letters that claim to be written by Paul. And so they conclude that Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, and all of the pastoral epistles are pseudepigraphical. They're not written by Paul, even though they claim to be written by Paul. Now, by no means is this certain, but this is a trend in New Testament scholarship to separate Paul's letters that way. And in the introductions to those letters, they'll talk about some of the criterion they use, such as the churches seem to be a little more structured in the pastoral epistles than what we think they probably were based on the other New Testament texts. Or Paul uses different words or writes in a different style in some of the disputed letters than in his undisputed letters. And of course, those are completely subjective criteria that assume that somebody can't write in two different styles, which anyone who's ever written an academic article versus sent an email or a love letter can attest that one person is plenty capable of writing in different styles. So that's just a very subjective criteria, but it's common in mainstream New Testament scholarship. Now, when we come to Romans' introduction and notes were put together by Paula Fredrickson. Paula Fredrickson is not a Christian scholar, a Jewish scholar. And I got to say, the introduction to Romans was very, very good. It covers the structure of the letter, the background of what was going on in Rome at the time, and also some of the ways that Romans was maybe misread by later interpreters, anachronistically applying later theological categories to what Paul was talking about in Romans. Then when you come to Romans 1, this is going to be obviously a point of contention in a progressive secular study Bible. So you have a note about LGBTQIA plus interpretations, because Romans 1 is typically seen as what they refer to as a clobber passage. And the note on it at the bottom, Romans 1:26 and 1:27, the note just says, some think that Paul here condemns homosexual acts by heterosexual people, others that he condemns sexual activity between adult males and boys. It's questionable whether Paul thought of homosexuality as a condition or as a disposition. I'm not exactly sure what they mean by that last line, but notice that it does leave out the other option, which is the traditional option, that Paul is referring to same-sex sexual relationships, period. Now, this is not surprising to see a note like this that just really doesn't give any credence to what is kind of the 2,000-year-long traditional Christian reading. So just be aware of it, though, that is the bias that you're getting in this section. However, interestingly, the notes throughout suggest that when Paul is talking about, in the early chapters, those who call themselves Jews, which traditionally has been taken to mean Paul's Jewish audience, actually Paul's talking about converts, God-fearers who have become circumcised, one who calls himself a Jew, perhaps because he has been circumcised. And so the reading that you're getting in these notes is Paul is talking to Gentiles who are trying to be holy by becoming Jews, as well as Gentiles who are coming from pagan backgrounds. Now, that's obviously not a view that every Romans interpreter shares, but it does represent the views of some in the Paul within Judaism school of thought. And that's the reading you get at Romans 7. According to Augustine, Paul here addresses Jews in a veiled way, speaking of himself, that chapter 7 is autobiographical. But if the rhetorical person is constant from Romans 2, Paul addresses Gentiles familiar with Jewish law who cannot fulfill it except through Christ. So Paul's not being autobiographical. He's actually taking on the persona of a Gentile who's trying to fulfill the law of the Jews. So he's not even dealing with Jews at all. And then the note at 7:7 on the I, just a very quick annotation. It says, I is probably stylistic rather than autobiographical. In other words, Paul's not talking about himself having this inner conflict, but rather he's speaking rhetorically. And they say because in Philippians 3:6, Paul says that he saw himself as having kept the law perfectly and didn't struggle with not being able to keep the law. So the I in this section must be somebody other than Paul, and therefore it's probably this rhetorical figure that he's been interacting with throughout the letter. In Romans 9, there's really nothing about election or predestination or all of those later reform questions that people have. There is a note here at 9:13 on the phrase, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated, that comes from Malachi 1, 2, and 3, and that loved and hated means chosen and not chosen, rather than actually loved or actually hated. But really no discussion of predestination, certainly not of Calvinism, Arminianism, any of those specifically Christian doctrinal discussions. And then on Romans 11, when you come to the full number of the Gentiles coming in and then all Israel will be saved, it doesn't really unpack it a lot. You get some brief annotations, verse 25 to 36. Paul explains God's plan for the redemption of all humanity, Israel and non-Israelite alike. and then until the full number, and that takes it as all 70 Gentile nations descended from Noah. So they see this as referring back to Genesis 10 and the table of nations. And then 11:26, all Israel, not just a remnant, will be saved. But they never unpack who the all Israel is. If all Israel is the bulk of ethnic Jews, or if all Israel is Jew and Gentile together in the Messiah as the olive tree, natural branches and wild branches. There's really no discussion of that or its implications. Now, another bright spot in this Bible are the Thessalonian letters, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, just a very good, quick overview, and they're done by our friend, Dr. Nijay Gupta. So Disciple Dojo confidently can recommend the study notes in this Bible on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians for sure. And lastly, we come to Revelation. The introduction to Revelation, I gotta say, this is a pretty good book introduction overall. It brings out some of the background of Revelation, what was going on at the time. It also notes some of the similarities between Revelation and ancient Near Eastern myths, particularly Revelation 12 and the combat myth, the chaos serpent motif. We've talked about that in our Professor Aquaman's Superhero Seminary lecture, as well as in our discussion of dragons in the Bible. And then it gives a good overview of the structure of the letter and how it unfolds in these cycles. The rest of the notes in Laodicea are pretty hit or miss. Like they completely miss the whole water issue by 3:15 and 16. Cold, hot, and lukewarm are figures of speech meaning against me, for me, and indifferent. That is a traditional way that this passage has been read, but it's certainly not the image that would have come to mind based on the water supply at Laodicea. But they do note that lukewarm may be a double entendre alluding to the tepid and nauseous local water supply. And that part's true, but they don't mention that the cold water was pumped in from Colossae and the hot water was pumped in from Hierapolis. And so originally cold and hot were both good. That's almost every Revelation commentary notes that. So I'm surprised to see them completely ignoring that, even though they do mention something about the water supply. And then another odd choice is they say of the 144,000 that are pictured as a great multitude, it says a great multitude, a heavenly assembly that may include, but is not identical with the 144,000 Israelites mentioned in verses 4-8. And I just flat out disagree with this note. I think the text is making it clear that just as the Lion of Judah was the Lamb of God back in chapter 5, that the armies of Israel, the 144,000, this military census, is the innumerable multitude that no one could count from every tribe, language, people, and nation. You can see Professor Lionel's lecture here on that subject, as well as our video on who are the 144,000. I don't know why they make that distinction right there. And then when you come to Revelation 20 and the 1,000 years, there's really nothing that talks about any of the ways that it's interpreted. There's just a note that says it's unparalleled in other Jewish apocalypses, but there's no discussion of how Christians have interpreted premillennial, amillennial, postmillennial. And then that's it. After Revelation, you've got some of the credits for the different visuals and illustrations, photos, and that's the end of the Bible. So let's talk about the pros and the cons before I tell you if I recommend it or not. The pros. This is an update and it's better than the HarperCollins Study Bible. If you are wavering between the two, go with this over HarperCollins. It has more content. The essays were much more developed. The book introductions are much more in depth. There are charts and diagrams throughout that the HarperCollins didn't have for the most part. And there are a number of scholars who contributed to this whose work I really appreciate. I mean, I've mentioned David De Silva, Nijay Gupta, but there are others like Richard Hayes, Richard Bauckham, Jacob Milgram, Bill Arnold. And graphically, I mean, for a 2-column study Bible, the layout is really good. It's clean. I do like the fact that all of the little call-out boxes are linked to BibleOdyssey.org, so you can actually go there and go deeper. And I like that it includes the apocryphal books. I think that is helpful in a study Bible. I wish more Protestant study Bibles would include the apocryphal books. I haven't used the NRSV UE enough. I grew up using the NRSV. I'm comfortable with the NRSV. Don't always agree with it, but that's true of any translation. I know that the NRSV UE is a little more, shall we say, ideologically motivated when it comes to passages dealing with sex and gender, but I haven't used it enough to know, other than those particular passages that's kind of made all the news when this came out, I don't know how overall the NRSV UE improves upon the NRSV. I've heard that it does in a number of places, but I just haven't looked into it enough. So I can't speak in any authoritative capacity about the UE version of the NRSV. But I do like that I have a print version at least available now. The cons. Let's talk about what's wrong with this study Bible. Just starting off surface-wise, like I said, this is the worst printing I've ever seen in terms of the thickness of the page and the bleed through. I mean, it's distractingly bad. People who normally don't care about that stuff, you'll probably care about it if you sink 30, 40, 50 bucks into one of these and have trouble reading the pages in normal light because the ink on the other side is spilling through. Just bad quality printing. The contributors are a mixed bag. I said before, I really like the work of some of the contributors. I really don't like the work of some of the other contributors. I won't name names or anything, but there is just scholarship in here that I think is severely misguided. It doesn't claim to be a Christian Bible, so that's a pro. But if you're looking for a Bible and you are a Christian, you're going to find a lot in here in the study notes, in the book introductions, in the call out articles. You're going to find a lot in here that goes against the historic Christian faith. So just be aware of that. I do like that there are so many women and minority scholars involved. I mean, I like the idea of a broader, more global take on the text. But again, when it comes to what the contributors are actually saying, that's more important to me than the demographic of the contributors. And more often than not, I found the notes in this and the introductions unhelpful than I did helpful. I mean, there were times I did find helpful. There is good material in here. You just got to sift through the chaff to get some of the wheat, in my opinion. So would I recommend the SBL Study Bible? Well, one, until they reprint it on better quality paper, no, I wouldn't recommend you buy this. But two, I would recommend this with the caveat that if you look at this as that's what they believe, and I want to have access to that so that I know and can be informed in discussions, then I could see this being useful. And that's what I got this for, actually. I have this for the same reason I have the Oxford Annotated Study Bible, or the New Interpreter's Bible, or the Annotated Jewish New Testament, for instance. I want to hear what others outside of my tradition are saying. But if you're looking for a study Bible to be your go-to study Bible, no, I would not recommend this. I don't think that's what anybody would benefit from using it as. So it's good to have on the shelf. But honestly, I would say just go to BibleOdyssey.org and read those articles. I don't think there's anything in this that necessitates getting a physical print version of it, honestly. Obviously, I haven't read every page of it, and I'm sure there is going to be other great material in it and other material in it that's going to make me want to continue pulling what's left of my hair out. But I know that's what I'm getting because that's what SBL is like. I would sit in on paper presentations that I thought were fantastic, and then I would sit in on some and thinking, how are you even coming to this conclusion? That's just SBL. That's what it is. Like I said, it's the Wild West. You are not going to be surrounded by people who agree with you. It is the opposite of an echo chamber. And the same thing with this study Bible. So it's about what I thought it would be, honestly. The one thing that I was not expecting, though, was just, again, the bad quality of the printing. And I hate to harp on it, but it's distractingly bad. So HarperCollins, you got to do better at the next printing of this thing if you want more people to buy it. That's all for now. Thanks for watching this review. Check out our other study Bible reviews here on the channel. We've reviewed, 50, 75 different study Bibles. So if you wonder about a particular study Bible, look in our playlist first. See if we've reviewed it. Chances are we have. As always, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time back here at Disciple Dojo. Keep training.